Hello everyone, and welcome to Dark Natter, the podcast where we take your favourite works of dark fiction and escort them across a dystopian wasteland, gradually developing a bond with them through shared peril and survival against the odds until we learn to love them as if they were our very own child. I am John Richter, and in today's show I am honoured to be rejoined by returning guest, musical virtuoso, video games expert and all-round ace bloke, Ryan Hamann.
Hello.
Hello, Ryan. Thanks for coming back.
Hey, good to see you again. Or I guess we're not seeing each other. Good to speak to you again.
That's true. There is like your little thumbnail is a picture of you, I think, so I can sort of see you.
That's right. We just have to specify, with the plague going on. We're taking reasonable precautions. We're doing this remotely, so yeah, we're being responsible.
Yeah, being in different countries is pretty safe, I think.
Yep, I'm in Seattle, and so, we've got the distance.
That is correct. But yes, that's... and I suppose even if there wasn't a plague going on, it's unlikely that you would have flown over here to join me in my flat. Oh, you might have done, and you'd be very welcome to. But maybe for your next appearance, we could...
Hey, I mean, if it's comped, then I'm more than happy to.
Deal. So I mentioned, actually, before we launch into your recent works in the video gaming and musical space, maybe for any listeners who missed your first appearance in season 1, if you want to introduce yourself.
Right. My name is Ryan Hamann. I'm a member of the Cane and Rinse podcast, as well as kind of sister shows on the same network, Sound of Play, where we cover video game music, and Playwright, in which I chat with another of the Cane and Rinse members about entirely kind of fictional, made-up video game ideas that we workshop together and end up coming away with something kind of original and cool and weird every single week. So number of podcasts I'm involved with, and that's I guess that's primarily where people know me from across the internet.
Oh, well, definitely. In my case, I'm a long-time fan of a lot of your work, but particularly Sound of Play, the video games music podcast. It's part of the Cane and Rinse stable. I've listened to every episode of that show over the months. And
see, I've still got some catch up to do, and I host half of them, so that's good.
It's like my sort of go-to. It's weekly, it's about an hour long, it's got great music in it, so it accompanies me when I go out for me runs, so it's you do a great job on that show. And of course you put together a lot of those kind of I guess you'd call them kind of musical collages for sort of 1 year of gaming at a time, and it's a bit of a big kind of mixtape, and I think some of those have been absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, that is just for the listeners' sake, I've been working on a project for the past I guess year in earnest. In previous years, I had done at the end of the year kind of a long mix of game music from games that had released that year. It's kind of like a nice, like an audio collage to kind of remind people of some of the experiences that they've had within the video gaming space within that particular year. And so within the last year, I've been kind of backfilling previous years. I've been alternating going backwards from years that hadn't been previously covered. So, 2016, 2015, 2014, with just doing kind of a random year in video game history. Okay. So, 1986 and 1999 and 2001 and all these years that are in. And so eventually I'm hoping to, have essentially every year in which video games had released have one of these mixes. And the project is, at the rate that I debut them, which is about one a month, we're still probably looking at like another couple years of these coming out, but it's been a fun project, and I get to, watch the little, watch the grid of all of the years kind of slowly start to fill up over time. Host that on the Playwright podcast website, and it's been fun to learn a lot about video game history through that project.
Yeah, I guess there's probably a question there, isn't there? I'm kind of assuming that, because video games is kind of your industry and one of your big focuses, you just know every single video game that's ever existed and the music. And of course that's not the case, because there's loads of them and huge amounts of kind of, I guess you're sort of discovering new games and new music all the time while you work through this big project.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of research that goes into it. I think the years that that are more kind of recent, the ones that I'm like actively living through, I can just kind of keep notes as the year goes as to, what's kind of a big deal. But, there's plenty of years before I was even born that I'm having to research anew. And, growing up, I had a handful of games every year because I was a kid and I didn't have the kind of disposable income that I have in 2020. And so, yeah, I am discovering a lot, and I'm trying to create these in such a way that it doesn't favor my particular lived experience either.
Yes.
Obviously, I'm going to give a little bit more love and attention to the titles that have kind of a personal significance to me, but I'm trying to keep it pretty neutral. And so kind of boosting prominent indies to the same level of kind of love and respect that I would give the big AAAs, of trying to research and understand the games that are important outside of America and outside of Europe, which is actually like more difficult than it sounds because, there just aren't that many English language websites that are talking about games that are popular exclusively in China, for instance. And so it's hard for me to do the research, but, I just, I use a ton of sources and just try to kind of scrub each year as thoroughly as I can and try to whittle down a list to usually around the kind of like 150 that are the most important in that year.
And it is interesting that thing about your own kind of personal bite. Like, if not that I ever would attempt to undertake a project like this because I am musically incompetent, but if I did, it would be completely dominated by like Bloodborne, Silent Hill, Doom, it'd just be all loads of horrible, gory games, basically. It's creepy soundtracks. Whereas, someone else might be more inclined to feature a load of, Nintendo, bright, cheerful Mario music. So it's commendable that you're trying to get a bit of diversity in the selection.
I always feel like every single game is going to be somebody's favorite that year. And so, obviously I'm not able to get every single game that released across the entire year, but I really want it to be something that in 100 years, if somebody goes back and listens to it, then they can get a pretty good sense of the year and not just kind of like my own personal taste, because my personal taste in the long run doesn't really matter that much.
Yeah, the purpose of your projects is to showcase video game music over the years, not your own personal taste in them, which is an excellent goal. Given, I suppose, that you are, video games is, I guess, the area of mutual interest for the two of us, it is perhaps no surprise that today's discussion point for Dark Natter is a video game franchise. But I'll just quickly explain the concept for anyone who's tuning in for the first time or is dead forgetful. I know, because, of course, as you know, Ryan, being a Dark Natter veteran, this is the show where we slice, dice and dissect works of dark fiction and decide whether they're worthy of a place in the haunted hallways of the Hall of Pain, which is like the Hall of Fame, but just creepier. The downside of this format, of course, is that because I love dark fiction so much, basically pretty much everything that anyone pitches gets in. So I've just ruined any sense of kind of drama or tension for the rest of the show, but never mind. And today is likely to be no exception because the franchise you are proposing today is a very, very good one. But I will let you introduce today's topic.
Right. Today we're going to be talking through the very popular PlayStation branded exclusive series, The Last of Us, which debuted on the PlayStation 3, and we just got the most recent iteration on the PlayStation 4 earlier this year with The Last of Us Part 2, which is Part 3 in the series.
Indeed it is. And yes, I tried to resist making just a really appreciative sort of sound effect there. Because I do think this is an excellent series of games, and I'm itching to get your thoughts on them, of course. And see where we get to. I probably should issue a great big, enormous, huge spoiler warning. So we will, we won't recap in minute detail, but we will skate over some of the key plot points. And our intention is to discuss twists and plot developments that occur in the games and to get Ryan's view of those. So if you haven't played The Last of Us, or the downloadable content, the DLC for The Last of Us, which was called Left Behind, which was released in 2014. And if you haven't played The Last of Us Part 2, which came out earlier this year, and you are interested in playing them in a non-spoilered way, then in the nicest possible way, naff off, please, and go and do that first, and then come back and listen to our thoughts, if that's okay. I'll give a moment for those people to make their exits. Goodbye. Okay, they've gone. Right, it's only people who've played them to death left, or people who like spoilers. Well, where to even start? Maybe, Ryan, if you want to tell us a little bit about your experiences of the very first game, The Last of Us, on PS3, as you rightly said.
Right. I bought The Last of Us, I think, around the launch period. It was one that I was kind of on the fence about when it originally came out. Because, Naughty Dog is, of course, one of the kind of big prominent brands on the PlayStation, one of the big developers. And I'm a little bit more kind of reserved in the amount of praise that I like to give Naughty Dog as a whole. Like, obviously, they're very talented developers, but I always get a little... there's almost kind of like a counter reaction that I have whenever some company or some game gets such like fervent fanboy craze, and so I always kind of like, all right guys, so let's take it easy. We all played Uncharted 3, right? Like, they're not the second coming of Christ. Like, come on.
I touched very briefly on the Dark Souls and Bloodborne earlier, because I know the two of us both really enjoy those games. I do think like From Software is another example of a company, a developer it's completely revered to the point where it almost starts to stretch. It's not stretch credibility, but they just seem to get away with even the bad decisions, and the crap bits just get completely swept away. And there's a 10 out of 10 review, and so there is sometimes you can approach these things and try to be a little bit more skeptical.
Yeah, but of course, like I never let that go into cynicism either. Like, I always want the best out of everything that the industry produces as well. I just try to at least kind of keep a check on my own fanboyism.
Yeah, it's very wise. Very wise.
So going into The Last of Us Part 1, I was thinking of kind of like not skipping it, but letting it kind of depreciate in price a little bit, because PlayStation exclusives especially end up kind of nosediving in price after enough time. You can get God of War 2018 and Spider-Man for virtually nothing these days. And so, it's always a good idea to wait on Sony titles. But when the kind of unanimous praise came around, I decided, like, let's hop in. This could be like another Uncharted 2 level of game, and it was getting kind of all the right discussion points from all the right people, and so I think I played it on PS3 around launch, and that was my experience. I played a bit more of it on PS4 via the remaster with the higher frame rate, but I don't think I ever finished it on the PS4. I think my lone time finishing the game was on the PS3.
I was exactly the same. It is an interesting thing about these big cinematic. It is a bit like playing. It's like a movie. It's a huge. It's much longer than a movie, but it's just a huge, very well acted, very well scripted, presented to you like a cinematic experience. And we'll come on to the good points of that. I do find I'm a bit kind of one and done. So I did the same. I played The Last of Us on the PS3 and really enjoyed it. I then bought the kind of remaster on the PS4 that had the higher frame rate, thinking, oh yeah, I'd love to play through that again, and higher frame rate, it's a no-brainer. And then I just never did. I could never be arsed, because once you know all the game's got to offer, I do find it is a bit difficult to motivate myself to kind of go back and just plow through all the same stuff again.
Yeah, one of the YouTubers I follow, Nakey Jakey, who is a very, very popular YouTube content creator, just put out a video probably 2 or 3 days ago about The Last of Us Part 2, and might be kind of reiterating a few talking points from that video kind of throughout the discussion here. But I think one of the points that he makes is that this game is paced in such a way, and I think this point can equally be applied to the first. The game is paced in such a way that the gameplay is good and is fun, but there are slower moments, which is is good for the pacing of a, any piece of art. You want those ups and downs, and but really kind of the interest curve, like the thing that really keeps you invested in those slower moments is the story and the mystery and the growing relationship between the characters and the way that it's acted. And so,
correct.
It's kind of like hearing the same joke twice. Like, you're not going to have that same experience the second time around. And if that level of mystery isn't there in those slower parts, then those portions of the game might not be as like welcome an addition as they were the first time around. And so it's a game that I think more than, more kind of gameplay first type of games might not suit a replay as well. But certainly its gameplay, I think, is strong enough to kind of hold up for repeated plays. And but yeah, I think mileage may vary on whether the pacing of the game, which is a definite strength in the first playthrough, works for or against it in subsequent playthroughs.
Yeah, and I can't remember. I know the second game does have a sort of go back and choose chapters, so you could replay favourite action sequences rather than having to play through the whole thing from the beginning. I can't remember if the first one had that. I believe
so. They've been doing chapters ever since Uncharted 1, I think. So I'd be very surprised if it didn't. I'm pretty sure it does. But even so, I think there's this type of game, there's a lot of survival elements in it and a lot of collection of resources as you go. And so I can't imagine going back to a random chapter would really kind of give you the same experience, because a lot of it is the kind of longer term preparations you're making for your journey. And even though you're not making like tremendous long-term, long-lasting changes, a lot of the crafting materials that you're going to be gathering are going to be used and replenished within a scene, oftentimes within the very room that you're in. But it does kind of add that kind of longitudinal element that might not hold up to a kind of episodic play style.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. It's almost like, you might fancy just playing through a little action scene, but when you strip away the sort of feeling of an epic quest, an epic journey, and the gathering and the scavenging of resources and the survival and that feeling of being up against it for such a prolonged period of time in that sort of wasteland dystopia, you strip all that away and you've just kind of got like an half decent stealth game. So although I think the gameplay in all of the games in the series is good, enjoyable, perfectly serviceable, it certainly for me the bit that was great about it was not the game bit. It was the overall story package, characters, surprises, and the experience, and certainly some of those kind of aforementioned plot points. That's the bit that really made it great for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a nice kind of it's a nice balance of the gameplay and story, and they both kind of play off each other well, at least in the first game. We'll get to the second game, but in the first game I feel like the themes really come through in both of those things together.
So in that first game, what was the I guess focusing on that sort of plot, character, themes, what were the ones that kind of resonated for you in that first playthrough?
Yeah, I think the games are post-apocalyptic in a way. And I guess, I mean, we put a spoiler warning up front, and so we're hoping that people have experienced these for themselves. But like, do you feel a plot recap is necessary for those who are just kind of going into this, just wanting to learn about the experiences?
I think that's a good idea. I think we will give a brief plot recap of each game before we kind of launch into the dissection. So the first The Last of Us features, it opens by introducing us to Joel Miller, who is a, I don't know, late 20s bloke, kind of like a cool kind of Texan sort of beardy guy, and he's spending a bit of time on the couch with his, I think she's 15-year-old daughter, or certainly younger.
She looks
daughter.
Younger than that. I would have guessed around 9, but I don't know. I'm bad with ages.
See, pass. I'm sure this can be Googled, but she is young, sweet, lovely daughter. They seem to have there's no mum in their life, so they live together.
If she was 15, she probably wouldn't be hanging out with her dad either. That's the age where they get real moody about that kind of thing.
I'm sure, yeah. Although, he is a cool dad. He's a cool dad. He wisecracks, he makes jokes. Yeah. And they seem to have this lovely relationship, don't they? It immediately comes across as they kind of like mock each other and take the piss. And then, in effect, we play initially as Sarah, as the girl, and we see the outbreak of a zombie outbreak, zombie virus type situation, very much a trope of, a genre we've seen countless iterations of. And Joel I think he has to shoot dead one of his neighbours who's been overcome by the infection. His brother Tommy shows up with a vehicle so that the three of them are kind of liberated. They escape from this zombie outbreak situation, only to find that it's a proper full scale. The hospital that they drive past has got zombified patients running out of it to drag people out of their cars and start biting them. There's a massive traffic pile up, so they can't get out of the city, and they end up, I think, involved in a car crash, which leads to Sarah being kind of incapacitated. I think she breaks a leg or something. So then you assume control of Joel. He's running along with Sarah. Tommy's helping them, and I think they leave Tommy behind because he's having to, hold a door, hold back the onslaught of encroaching zombies. And Joel and Sarah, they encounter a military guy, in full sort of whatever you'd call it, gas mask type gear, and assume that, oh great, we've found help, he can help us, my daughter's injured, we need help. And the guy he talks to his commander and he's like, but sir, they don't seem to be infected. And you realise this horrible moment, he's been instructed to shoot them, and he does. And then Tommy, Uncle Tommy, as it were, reappears, shoots the soldier in the head. We think maybe saving Joel and Sarah, only to find that Sarah is fatally wounded and she dies in his arms. And that is the game's opening. Cut to 20 years later, Joel in his, late 40s or whatever, look grizzled, grey-haired, real miserable and dour. And that bit, for whatever reason, because I always try and dodge spoilers before I play a new game, because I knew it was a game about a bloke and a young girl, I just fully and completely assumed that Sarah, this young girl who we were introduced to in the beginning, I assumed she was going to be the main protagonist of the game. So I was completely not expecting her death. I was really affected by it. It made me really, choked up kind of playing it. And I didn't realise I was going to be playing as grief-stricken, emotionally shut down, kind of wreck Joel in the dystopia. That was a complete surprise to me the first time I played it. What did you think of that opening, Ryan?
I think it's a very strong opening. I think it kind of thinking back on it, like it is the only scene that kind of takes place in a pre-apocalypse world.
Yes.
So, it has such a different kind of mood and feeling from the rest of the game. There are, the world is starting to experience its kind of first wave of destruction. And I just think it's very interesting how you start off kind of in this dark house, and you hear kind of news broadcasts that are kind of confusedly conveying details of a situation that's, which is something that we've seen in a lot of sci-fi and horror, but mostly sci-fi types of fiction before, is kind of the news broadcast that doesn't quite know what they're looking at, almost like a War of the Worlds type of thing, that kind of sets up some of the plot details. But it's a good way of kind of easing you into the experience. It would have been, even knowing where it ends up going, like you purchase the game, you have an idea of what type of game it is. Like it's not there to necessarily surprise you. I think it does set the table stakes for what the world is like beforehand. And which is something that I think you have to do in zombie games to an extent. Like the tragedy of zombie games and the kind of destruction of society is kind of falling from where society was to, where it is now. And, the reason that, a lot of these zombie types of fictions take place, or ghost types of fictions as well, take place in these kind of old, broken down, Victorian manors and plantation homes. And this one takes place in a lot of cities, is just because they want to convey kind of the grandeur, the kind of the greatest architectural achievements of humanity, and these lavish homes and
showcase them in the derelict sort of state, and you really ram home that point about how much society has fallen away and crumbled to ruin.
Kind of the juxtaposition reads as kind of almost like blaming this on mankind's hubris. Like this is a Titanic story, and it kind of goes without saying, like humanity was able to create this beautiful city. You spent a lot of time in Boston, and that's kind of one of the big cities that you get to see throughout much of the game. You're able to see these monstrous skyscrapers that we've all been in cities, but like it looks even bigger when you are climbing in and out of broken windows and they just feel enormous and they feel monumental. And it's like humanity was able to build this, but a simple fungus kind of crept in and it took everything down. And now this entire landscape of human magnificence is being entirely reclaimed by nature, almost like humanity had never owned it in the first place. And so it really is a Titanic story. Yes. And I mean, it really feels very pertinent to like coronavirus right now. It's like humanity is, absolutely, especially living in America, like America is the richest country on earth or something. I don't know if that still is the case, but it's, it's one of the,
I think still the largest economy and, right. The biggest military force.
They called the United States global leaders, but still like there are, like we have a quarter of the cases of coronavirus in the entire world. Like we are like especially bad at handling something as primeval as a disease. Like there's a juxtaposition there again, isn't it? It's you've that since I've been alive, I'm nearly 40. The US has been the big dog in the yard, and suddenly it's like, oh, this. We trick ourselves into thinking we've somehow sort of mastered nature, but it's like actually we're all still mortal. We all still die of old age. We often die of other things, and we can't really we can't really control insects and vermin properly. We there's all these naturally occurring things that the weather that we can't master at all, and this virus has proved to be a perfect example of that. All we can do is kind of sort of cower in our homes and hope it doesn't get us, and it's a stark reminder of our own sort of inconsequentialness in many ways. You say that's all that we can do. That's all that we can do as individuals, maybe, but like as a collective, like we could beat the virus if we really wanted to. And we don't want to get off on a whole kind of political tangent here, but like we've seen other countries effectively manage the virus, but it seems like the countries that have kind of the biggest stake of hubris here, like the United States and Great Britain, are the ones who are uniquely unable to. Yeah,
there's probably a correlation there, isn't there, between, dare I say, what the governments perceive that people will tolerate as measures to manage the virus, and therefore their willingness to implement those measures, and not implementing very many very effective measures, and as a result, people suffering. Maybe to touch on the kind of virus element in the game. And don't worry, we won't go into as minute detail of the plot as we did of the introduction. But in simple terms, what I do think is a brilliant twist on the zombie sort of genre. This is strictly speaking, it's not actually a virus, or it's at least its inception is different. It's a cordyceps fungus, which does occur in nature and does affect other animals, like, I don't know, ants is the one that perhaps people might have seen on nature documentaries. Horrifying, really. It's a fungus that emits spores. If you breathe them in, if you happen to be an ant in real life, then the fungus itself is able to, in effect, control and manipulate the animal's body and cause it to, affect its brain, take control of its limbs, in effect, sort of like some sinister kind of marionette. It will cause the ant to, stop knocking about with its, whatever you call a group of ants, a herd of ants. It will no longer wish to follow the herd. It will go maverick, try and climb up a nearby, shrub or whatever to get to high ground, where the fungus then bursts out of its chest, alien style, to cough up this the fungal spores and infect more of the group. And which is, if you Google that, there's some really creepy images of these kind of fungal infected, insects with shit bursting out of their chests like a scene from Alien. And of course, someone's had the brilliant idea, well, what if that affected humans? What would that be like? And it's such good images in this game of these kind of half fungal, deformed, sometimes it's people who've kind of grown into the wall. Really, really disturbing imagery.
This is one of the strongest aspects of the game, I think. Just the kind of concept around these fungal zombies. I don't think they're the first ones to have attempted this, but fungus is creepy already. There's so many like weird and really kind of disturbing shapes that you see mushrooms grow into in nature. And so seeing this element kind of fuse with humanity in the way that it really reminds me of the second Pirates of the Caribbean movie, where Davy Jones' crew is, they are becoming kind of inextricably linked to the sea, and his crew has barnacles growing all over them, and eventually they just kind of like the zombies in this game kind of grow into the walls of the ship, because they've become in a Ship of Theseus kind of style, no longer anatomically distinguishable from the ship because the ocean has kind of replaced them cell by cell.
Yes, yeah, so evocative, and there's this idea of becoming one with, in that case, your ship, or in the case of The Last of Us, almost the walls of the building that you spent all your time in. There's so much kind of emotional sort of resonance there. It's such a good idea and such a scope for real horrifying set pieces, which, to the game's credit, I think, you touched on that kind of light and shade, slower paced elements. It doesn't then spoil it by going completely overboard with an endless onslaught of, B-movie fungal zombies. It manages to... in effect, it's really far-fetched and daft, isn't it? But it feels very serious. The tone is very serious, and the game feels...
It all feels very plausible as well, which is one of the strengths, is, having a kind of a zombie infection that's based on based on a real fungus that is like a creepy thing that exists in real life, and having... means of transmission through spores, which, in this case, it feels a little bit kind of like a having your cake and eating it too type of situation, because it also very heavily implies, I guess it doesn't even imply, it states it outright, that being bitten, kind of like a traditional zombie virus, also passes the infection.
Also
which
infection.
I don't know if that fully squares with if you want it to pass through the respiratory system via spores, then make that the way that it spreads, not bites as well. But it's kind of traditional zombie movies. The modern fiction of zombies takes inspiration from rabies and that virus, which animals pass via bites. And so that's kind of where that comes from. And so to have it also kind of cross-pollinate with this fungal infection, I think it's more of kind of like a genre shorthand, which I don't mind. It's just kind of there are situations in the game where you are entering a building that is overtaken by kind of airborne spores, and that is supposed to be kind of the threat there. It's if you breathe these in, that's it for you. But then it's also but also if you get bitten, or also if this and this happens to you, it's it's kind of hard to weigh these threats against each other.
I know, and everyone in the game seems remarkably blasé about the spores as well. Just stick your gas mask on, you'll be all right.
It is many years past the outbreak, and so it's something that they've been having to deal with for a long time. But from a gameplay perspective as well, they don't really end up doing that much with the spores. Spores are kind of chest high cover in other third-person shooters, where it's you enter a room with spores, that means zombies are going to be there. It is 100% a visual indicator with, I can't think of any mechanical, any time when they really do something interesting from a gameplay perspective with the spores. I suppose
that the indicator aspect of it in some ways is maybe a positive. So like you said, the chest high cover thing is a bit of a, that's a tell, and it's a giveaway, and it's kind of breaks the immersion. You're oh right, this clearly is a boss arena, this is a battle, oh right, we're going to have a fight now, and it kind of spoils whereas the presence of the spores is a very deliberate, that's a graphical, if I was that character and I went into a spore-ridden, underground, basement, I would go, oh shit, there might be some of the monsters here. I better take precautions and proceed more carefully. And of course, the music ramps up the tension, and to me, that kind of works. That builds up the dread in the horror elements or the horror bits of the game.
Yeah, we should also say that like the game is very combat heavy, but there are kind of two modes of combat. There are two types of enemies, which is the zombies of various types. And of course, they don't call them zombies in the game. I'm just going to refer to them as that because of the cultural shorthand.
Agreed.
It's easier than kind of going into, the whole, anyways. And then there's the humans as well, which are typically armed with firearms or melee weaponry. So there's different types of combat encounters. And I think having kind of that visual shorthand to tell you kind of what to be preparing for ends up being helpful, because you have to fight the humans and the zombies in different ways.
Yes, and you're quite right. The game certainly mines that seam of, who's the real monster? Is it the zombies or is it the survivors who've banded together into these groups? And you do meet some real dicks in this game, don't you? So
and you end up becoming one in the next.
Well, absolutely. And that's gonna. I can't wait to get there, because I can't wait to hear your thoughts on the sequel. But well, maybe to almost to kind of conclude on the first game. In effect, the bulk of the game sees Joel, who is this real kind of cynical, bitter smuggler type who's carving out making a living in the dystopia by doing some pretty nasty stuff. He ends up having to escort a young girl across, basically across half the country to a group of survivors who are calling themselves the Fireflies, and in effect, this girl is found to be immune to is it a virus, is it a fungus, we're not quite sure. The Firefly's intention is to make use of her immunity to attempt to construct some sort of cure or vaccine. So we get this long kind of road movie, sort of quest type narrative, where gradually Joel, his feelings soften and he grows to enjoy the company of this, dare I say, kind of like tomboy, slight foul-mouthed, kind of potentially slightly annoying kid, but who's, heart of gold kind of thing. And they survive countless kind of scrapes, perils, and all manner of adventures together. And Ellie, the girl in question, she helps Joel survive at one point when he's horrendously wounded. And so they finally make it to their destination. And again, the game tricked me again. It might not have tricked others, but it definitely tricked me. And I just thought, I see what's happening here. It's going to be a really sad ending where Joel learns to love again, only to have yet another daughter figure, sadly sacrificed. But at least it's for the benefit of humanity and everyone gets cured. And I thought that was going to be the sad, moving ending. And I was gearing myself up to that emotionally. And instead, Joel changes his mind and goes on a absolute murder killing spree, slaughters all the Fireflies, all the doctors, all the innocent people who were preparing to work on this cure, liberates the unconscious, about to be operated on Ellie from the facility, and does a runner with her, and decides he doesn't give a shit about humanity. He just wants a daughter back in his life, and lies to the girl about what happened, and passes it off as it turned out that they weren't able to extract a cure. Never mind, let's just crack on with living, eh? And that is such a unexpected, bleak, surprising, sour ending to that first game, which, as you can tell, I absolutely loved. But what did you make of it, Ryan?
I mean, it is a very interesting turn for the tale to take, because it is kind of like a parable where the character didn't learn the lesson in a way, but it's also it's a complex issue because there are arguments to be made on both sides, and I think my personal philosophy falls very much on one side of it. Like, I'm very much like a society at large over those who are close to you type of person. And so, if I, was in a position where I had to either save the lives of, 100 strangers or one family member, like, I would be the 100 strangers type of person. And that's not to say, not to pass judgment. in either direction. I think there's like that family connection is very important and obviously has this kind of evolutionary and societal advantages as well. And so, not to say that somebody is necessarily wrong for choosing the other one. I think we all just need to come to grips, especially in a story like this, with what type of person we naturally are.
And it's a great point. There's so much, because you do see people reacting to this story with oh yeah, not in a heartbeat, I would never sacrifice my, let's say, daughter. Let's be really kind of evocative about it. I'd never sacrifice my daughter, no matter, for any reason. I don't give a shit about 100 people or, billions of people as it is, or however many survivors there are supposed to be in the world now, at least millions. And some people would see Joel's decision as absolutely, completely the right one, and they'd be kind of staggered to hear someone saying the opposite. I'm with you. I think that certainly when you talk about the, A, she's not his actual daughter. Does that matter? Maybe not. B, we're talking about the entire future of the human race is at stake. I'm on the he ought to, and she was prepared to make the sacrifice. That's the interesting thing. It's Joel who rips that away from her. I
think the writers are ultimately kind of on our side as well. Not that really matters.
Yes.
Obviously the point of art is to kind of put an interesting piece of kind of discussion out there and let the community kind of take from it what they will and to draw their own conclusions. But the second game essentially is, just grappling with that question.
Well, maybe if we use that as a neat segue to the sequel, we'll perhaps come back just to touch on the DLC at some point briefly. But The Last of Us Part 2, given how pretty perfect that first game felt as a sort of story, I almost was a bit like, what are they going to do in The Last of Us 2? I can't even imagine what story they're going to tell. And I personally liked the story I liked the story they chose to tell, and we'll come on to whether they then did a good job of telling it, if you see what I mean. But in effect, we start with a now 19-year-old Ellie living in a fairly well-established sort of settlement with Tommy and with Joel and also brother Tommy, who is also a survivor from the first game. So they live there in this well-established, fairly large community that still danger. They've big walls around it to keep out the infected. They have to go out on daily dangerous patrols to kill off infected that are, seem to like gathering in great big massive hordes. Just up the road. So they have to go and keep the numbers down. And Ellie is obviously a growing young woman, so she's starting to have relationships. There's a character called Dina who is introduced as someone else who lives in the town who's about Ellie's age. Ellie and Dina have a lesbian relationship in the game, or it's blossoming in the early stages. But there's a lot of friction between her and Joel, and we don't yet know exactly the nature of it, but we certainly get the sense that Ellie suspects that something isn't quite as he told her. That incident at the hospital 4 years ago didn't quite pan out as Joel has perhaps told her. And then we're introduced to a new character, which is a character called Abby, who is another young woman, very physically imposing, muscle-bound, strong kind of character. And she is leading a group of sort of comrades, sort of military type team to this settlement, and we don't yet know to what purpose. And the events of the game thrust Abby into contact with Joel and Tommy, who are out on a patrol when a huge horde attacks. They rescue her, and at her kind of advice, they proceed with her to this chalet that Abby's group have chosen to occupy, whereupon Abby shoots Joel in the leg with a shotgun, and in a very kind of emotionally raw scene where she's visibly, incredibly distressed, she beats him to death with a golf club. Ellie turns up to try and rescue Joel because she becomes aware that he's in trouble, along with Dina, and is unable to save him. And Abby's group leave Ellie and Dina alive, and Tommy. He's also left alive, but Joel is dead. So the game opens with this absolutely shocking, really brutal, not at all heroic or melodramatic. It's just this real shocking kind of murder of the first game's main character. And maybe before we come on to why Abby does this and take the plot forward, what did you make of that sort of development, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, Joel's action at the end of the last game was, a pretty like morally reprehensible thing in my view. And so I didn't really feel that great of sympathy. I mean, obviously there's the kind of trauma that's being experienced by Ellie having to watch this all go down. And of course you've spent a lot of time getting to know the characters, but also, like, again, kind of going back to that philosophical point earlier, like just because somebody, like just because you're close to a bad person does not mean that they are worth higher moral consideration than if you hadn't known them. Like, he did something terrible that was on the species level a damaging act potentially. And so
yes, and pretty selfish. He arguably he didn't do it for Ellie. He did it for himself because he wanted another crack at being a dad,
Yeah, and so it's, on one hand, like he kind of had it coming in a way. Like, I'm not one of those repay violence with violence types of people, but like, in this world, especially in this very brutal world, it didn't feel out of place. And you learn more and more kind of as the story goes on, like the kind of personal stakes behind it. And as more and more was revealed, I'm just kind of like, yeah, okay. I mean, that's it seems like a pretty open and shut case to me.
It's a really interesting one because I'll quickly recount my sort of emotional journey with the game. And then my brother played it, spoiler free, and had exactly the same emotional journey as I did. So I went, Abby's turned up and murdered Joel. I love Joel. Now I hate Abby. I cannot wait for that bitch to die. That was kind of, I was sort of saying these, texting this to my friends or whatever. Ellie, I cannot wait till Ellie goes and she's going to get her comeuppance. And of course that is, certainly the first half of the game, you play as Ellie on a revenge mission. Ellie and Dina travel to Seattle, coincidentally, to murder Abby. And that's a big chunk of the game. You get to this, 20 hours in or whatever, and there's finally Ellie has killed off some of Abby's closest friends, people who were there at the incident, and they're finally thrust together. And in what you think is going to be the finale, only for the game to then throw you back several days and play through as Abby for several days leading back up to that point. And as you say, there's a lot of revelations about Abby's motivations, about her past, about why she hates Joel so much. And by the time I got back to that finale scene, I'd completely transformed from I hate Abby to I really sympathise with Abby. I like her. She's a really good person. Maybe a bit harsh with the old golf club, but I no longer have this feeling of hatred and revenge, bloodthirst. And I almost ended up. To be honest, I ended up in a place of I just like both of them, and I just wish they could like be friends and maybe move on with their lives. I don't know how you found it.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of even swung further in the other direction. Like when Ellie set out on her quest for revenge, I think at the beginning, like reading into authorial intent, which again, like only takes you 10% of the way in the journey. Like it doesn't ultimately end up mattering, but it feels like the type of story that they're trying to set up is kind of like you are supposed to feel her indignation and her rage, and you're supposed to want the revenge along with her. And so the quest is almost kind of like a holy war that you're setting out upon, or kind of like a justified revenge that you are trying to exact. And so you're supposed to feel really kind of on Ellie's side here, and then the point at which you change perspectives over to Abby is supposed to kind of switch that, and you're supposed to kind of slowly gain more empathy with the character, and then at the point at which they converge, you're supposed to be at kind of a conflicted state where you understand both perspectives and want, those competing objectives for both of them, but that you can't have both. And so there's this internal struggle. And I didn't really get that, because at the point at which, Joel was murdered, I was like, that was violent. That was shocking. But ultimately that's the way that the world is here. And he was kind of a monster, and he had murdered people in worse ways than that himself multiple times. Like, I was ready to kind of
literally hundreds of people.
I was ready to chalk it up as a loss. Like, that is, this character's ending. Like, that is the end of his story. Ellie went off on her revenge journey, and at the very beginning I was like, no, you know what? Don't go back home, live your life happily. Don't venture out. I mean, I love a 3D recreation of Seattle. And so I'm like, let me walk around in Seattle for a little bit. But once you're done sightseeing, let's go home. Let's not kill anybody. This is just the way that the world is. Joel's nothing special. Like, he's just another person trying to make his way in the world. Don't murder more people to try to. And so by the time when I got into Abby's shoes, I went into it not hating her, but having kind of a neutral opinion on, like, okay, she seems pretty brutal, but she's a survivor trying to make her way in the world. Let's see what her story's about. And so I went into it with kind of like a more open mind. And then by the time I ended up kind of getting through her story, I was really kind of at most of the points in her story, I was kind of like neutral to vaguely positive towards her, because, she has some good interactions with her friends. I think the point that really won me over was when she met Lev, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah. Yes.
But then, definitely. I was so kind of negatively disposed to Ellie throughout this game. I didn't believe in anything that she was doing. And I felt like she was so villainous that, like, I didn't have that tearing of the spirit that I think is necessary to really enjoy this game, to really get the most emotionally out of the game. I was so one-sided on Abby's side and so against Ellie that I was just like, now you're switching me back to Ellie. I'm just playing as the villain again, which is fine, but it would be more interesting, I think, if I was more of two minds about it.
Yeah, and maybe I guess maybe this is as good a time as any to touch on some of the controversy around the game. So there's a camp of people who think the game is brilliant, loved it, felt that really wrenching kind of emotional journey. I'm in that camp, and I guess in some ways, like you say, that authorial intent. I think it'd be fair to say the author's intent worked on me. I feel like I went through the emotional up and down that the authors, which by the way we should mention, so that the games were both directed by Neil Druckmann. The first one I think was Neil Druckmann and Bruce Straley, whereas the sequel was Druckmann, Anthony Newman, Kurt Margenau, whose name I'm sure I've mispronounced, but also co-written by Haley Gross, so a different co-writer brought in for the second game. And I think that narrative that you've just outlined brilliantly, worked on me. I went through the ringer and came out the other side and, said lots of positive things about the game. But then there were other people who perhaps had the experience you had, where you were a bit like, Ellie's just a dick. I don't care about this person. I think Abby's fully justified. Talking about my siblings, my sister who played this game, one of my sisters, in fact I think both of my twin sisters who played it were like, Ellie's a dick. We like Abby. What are you talking about? and then there were others who seemed to be completely anti-Abby. They didn't feel, when they were presented with her side of the story, they were like, nope, not interested. I hate this woman. She killed Joel. And also, I'm going to go a step further. And that group of people, some of them, the more sort of toxic group, they seem to say, and I also hate Druckmann and Gross for making this game and for killing Joel. And I hate Naughty Dog. And I hate The Last of Us 2. And I'm going to review bomb it on, Metacritic. And I found some of that. I found all of those behaviours just completely baffling and annoying and stupid, to be frank. I get being upset when a beloved character dies, but I don't get sending death threats to the voice actor of the character that killed him.
There's a lot of toxicity within the video game community, which is a shame. Yeah. And so, you kind of have to expect a certain amount of shittiness from, certain corners of the internet. And unfortunately, like a lot of I don't want to say a lot, I don't know how to quantify, I'm not going to guess at a quantification, but there was an amount of that shittiness that was coming from kind of the same groups that you would expect to come down especially hard on a female video game protagonist who's not conventionally attractive. There was a lot of people who were like kind of crying foul over like, women shouldn't be this this muscular, it's unrealistic, and
and people trying to argue that they were genuinely trying to say that it's unrealistic in an apocalypse because there's no steroids, so a woman could not be this muscular. Therefore, my criticisms are totally justified. Like,
it's all a smokescreen. But like, what I want to do, I want to acknowledge those arguments as a way of kind of compartmentalizing that, saying like that is 100% not part of, like, that's dumb, like that's stupid. We're not trying to lump people that don't agree with us on these story points into that group. I think there were a lot of people who genuinely disagreed with the story, and we want to be very clear that like those people and like the toxic gamer bros are not always the same people. Like there's overlap, but like they're not. And so if we are disagreeing with certain points, or if we're saying that like certain parts of the community were upset that Joel was killed by Ellie, or that Joel was killed by Abby, excuse me, we're not trying to lump them in with the like misogynists as well.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and it's a shame, isn't it? Because some of that toxicity, I guess, has kind of polluted a very what otherwise is a really interesting debate about whether this story is good, bad, effective, ineffective. Because I do think, I certainly get the point that says maybe this story doesn't quite work, particularly, for example, if you just feel a sense of, no, you know what, Ellie's motivations are just not something I can kind of relate to.
But so I think there's a lot of interesting arguments to be made. This almost, Last of Us Part 2 as a whole almost feels like a metatextual commentary on Part 1, where they recognize that people, they had built Joel to be ultimately the villain of the game, and the fact that you play as him throughout the entire experience and you grow this emotional bond, it's meant to be devastating at the end when he does something that you ultimately can't condone. And you have to, by way of taking control of that one level, you're kind of complicit in that action in a way. It's meant to be like a real kind of emotional experience, but I think they might have observed a lot of people not taking it as such, of being kind of like, this is a great kind of, badass way to end a action game. And, you see those collages of video game, badasses, the kind of the Batman and Ezio and the Sam Fisher and all these kind of like characters that are like, the tough grizzled white men who, and generally they'll be captioned like, I'm a gamer, I don't have a life, I have many, or something like that, something like the kind of machismo gaming types of motivational posters for teenagers types of things. When they started kind of including Joel among that lineup of the kind of aspirational video game badasses, I feel like the writers at Naughty Dog must have been a little disheartened that maybe the message that they had intended to convey didn't end up getting through. And so maybe that was part of what motivated the sequel, or necessitated the sequel in a way, is just them doubling down on like, no, he is not the hero.
This was the point we were trying to make.
He did something very wrong. And it seems like with this reaction to Abby's actions, and, of course, death penalty is never the right way or whatever, but like, even like the fact that people are saying like, you killed Joel, I love Joel, even now is like,
it's like, why did you love Joel?
They have to be tearing their hair out. Like,
what was there to love about him?
You guys are supposed to have contempt for him, moral contempt. Like, how are you still not getting there? But like,
it's a funny one, because I definitely ended the first game in that really bizarre position of completely disagreeing with Joel's decision at the end of the game, and yet I still liked him as a bloke and was sad when he got killed. It doesn't make any sense. So maybe there is an element of, just as you say, maybe there's a thing of, I've almost been kind of conditioned to just like these, tough old grizzled father figures, and I just can't shake that easily, and therefore you can end up, that person's terrible and they did a really bad thing, but bless him. It seems crazy.
There's a lot of stories like that as well. There's not just anti-heroes, but there's a lot of comedies are about people who are bad people that you want to end up winning. A lot of heist movies, you're following around a bunch of thieves and you just kind of hope that they get a one-up on an even worse person. And there's nothing wrong with having an emotional connection to somebody that you're supposed to be rooting against. Like, that's the way that deep stories are made, but like, it's in a kind of parable kind of way, you're supposed to walk away with an understanding of like, even the people that I care about are, able to make terrible decisions.
Yeah, and so fascinating kind of insight there into what maybe was the thought that, as you say, necessitated the sequel almost to try and double down and reiterate the point of the first one. Well, maybe before, to make sure we cover it, because it's really important, is speaking of emotional connections, you touched on the character Lev. Lev is a trans boy who is young, I think 15 again. I keep guessing 15 for all the characters. I don't know if that's the case or not. Certainly teenage. And he encounters Abby, who are in effect on opposing sides. One thing I sort of failed to touch on in the plot synopsis was that in Seattle is this war-torn sort of hellhole where you've got the WLF, the Western Liberation Front, who call themselves the Wolves, which is Abby's, pretty big, well-established military group, versus another group who are derogatorily referred to as the Scars, because they sort of cut themselves on their faces as part of their kind of religion. And they're this kind of like embrace the old values, it's bow and arrow instead of gun, everything's kind of wooden, and everything's kind of back to the old world. And Lev is a young man from that group, and we're told that Lev is an outcast and is being actively hunted to be killed by his own group. I think they're actually, the correct term for them is the Seraphites. That's what they call themselves, not the Scars, which is what the WLF call them.
It's kind of a derogatory term. They take it
correct.
As such.
They are offended if you call them a Scar. And so Abby and Lev are kind of thrust together. I think they're both about to be killed, aren't they? And they kind of escape together. And we're told that Lev is being hunted because he chose to shave his head. And you're like, what? Like, for that you're going to get killed? And maybe this is obvious to other people, it wasn't obvious to me, and it had to be kind of spelt out. We realise later that Lev was born a girl and has decided, is making this kind of transition into a different gender, and that's the reason that this is viewed as unacceptable to the Scars, and that's the reason that he's being hunted and treated as a pariah. And so that was, that's a powerful story that character has, and also testament to Abby's positive qualities, that she takes him under her wing and saves Lev multiple times, and they become a real tight-knit little kind of duo.
Yeah, it's interesting how the strength of The Last of Us Part 1 was that this kind of father-daughter, surrogate relationship was being formed. And really the background of this kind of zombie outbreak was more kind of set dressing than anything else. Like, the real intrigue of the story was like entirely kind of domestic and entirely something that could be happening equally well, just, in a conversation in a diner in a small town. It's not something that necessitated a cross-country journey fraught with danger in a zombie wasteland. Like, it was a story about people doing like more or less like normal life emotional work. It was just, kind of the surrounding elements were what made it really interesting. And this is kind of the same way. Like one of my big criticisms of The Last of Us Part 2 is that it feels like it spends so much time commenting on Part 1. It spends so much time almost kind of like obsessing over the story that has already been told, that like it takes a long time before it really introduces new talking points in a way, it doesn't.
Yeah, I do. Like, it doesn't really, like we talked about Ellie and Dina as a relationship, a new character. And I you may disagree. I feel like Dina, like, I really like Dina. She seems like a nice person, but she just sort of willingly goes along with Ellie. Yeah, let's just go on this murder spree, whatever you want. We don't get much backstory for Dina.
She doesn't have a lot of agency. She's really just kind of along to support Ellie, and there's not that much that develops in their relationship other than just kind of like heightened impairment as kind of the stakes are raised as it's revealed that she's pregnant, which again, like it's not really used in that interesting a way. And if it wasn't for the post game chapter in a way, that would almost feel a little bit,
sort of throwaway, like wasn't necessary for the story,
or even
at all.
Exploitative in a way. You know, it's like you're going to make this character pregnant just to kind of raise the peril of the situation and then never touch back on it again. Like they did touch back on it, and they did kind of make it an interesting story point. And so I'm not arguing that that's the way that it ended up, but like, you know, their relationship was more kind of functional than it was something that really kind of explored deeper. And so, you know, when Lev was brought into the story, you know, his struggle is also very domestic. You know, he's essentially, his story is like, he came out as a trans man to his mother who didn't accept him because of her religion.
Yes.
And again, boiled down to those components, like that is the interesting character arc. And that is not the arc. That is that's a situation that kind of surrounds the narrative there. That could happen equally well in a zombie outbreak versus just in a regular city scenario. And so
yes,
it's telling an interesting story about him like still believing that his mother can be reached and ultimately having a tragic encounter with her when it turns out that, you know, she is kind of beyond saving in that way.
Yeah, she views her religion as more important than her son's, you know, happiness, and that is a real tragic scene.
The zombie scenario just kind of like heightens the stakes of that and just kind of adds some more flavor to it, but it doesn't, you know, the story is about his story, I guess. There are multiple stories that take place kind of concurrently, but his story is super relatable, and just like it's a very, you know, it's a very normal story, just kind of told with abnormal circumstances, which makes it more interesting.
And as you say, it almost by its very nature, well, you make a great point, it's also a new story about a new person, and the story has nothing to do with the events of the first game. So that's good, that it's not this completely kind of self-reflective, you know, revisit. And secondly, it's a story that it isn't because there's a zombie apocalypse that's happening. That's just a story that is happening and does happen to lots of trans people all the time in the current, you know, world when their parents don't approve of how they are and how they feel. So it is. I do think Lev immediately becomes one of the strongest characters in the game as a result, and a really interesting character.
And that's really the point at which the game picked up for me, because like this game is a lot longer than the first game as well, and at points in the game you do feel the length. And we had that. We got to a point where we were a bit like, really? This really isn't the end? You know, and there was like a bit of a false finish, isn't there, towards the end? And although on one level, like, I like the false finish and I like being kind of trolled, there was a bit of like, oh my god, what? I have to do another evening of, you know what I mean? You know, even kind of at that halfway point, you're kind of like, I get the trajectory of the game. It's trying to be Man in the Iron Mask, and it's not really. Sorry, Count of Monte Cristo. That's the piece of classic literature I was intending to reference.
You're just showcasing your knowledge, your immense knowledge of classic literature.
How little knowledge I have that my brain completely swaps two pieces of. Anyways,
more than mine.
But like by that point, by that kind of like middle point in the story, like I was having a hard time trying to understand, you know, what is the thread that's keeping me going. And so when I met Lev, who's a delightful character, just like a joy to be around, he has like such a great mix of being like naive to the old world, which is fine because like, why would you be knowledgeable about the old world? The old world doesn't exist anymore. But like that makes like for a really fun kind of dynamic between him and Abby, who is more kind of knowledgeable about the old world, but she is, I mean, even though living in it, she's not super knowledgeable about, you know, the world of The Last of Us in a way. Like, you know, she is a terrific survivor. Like she's great at doing what she needs to get by, but like Lev really understands the dynamics of this new world, and he can run laps around because the Seraphites are the ones who like really kind of own the space of this broken down Seattle, and they have secret pathways.
Yeah, they've made their skyways, and
so he's able to teach her about the new world. She's able to teach him about the old world. They're always kind of correcting each other's terminology and learning about each other's societies, which had thus been kind of like taboo. They have kind of a slowly kind of distrustful, growing to be more trustful relationship with one another. And both are kind of reckoning with killing members of each other's camps that might have been friends or family. Like there's so much interesting dynamic going on between the two of them that was like, at that point in the story, I was like, okay, like now I care. Like, this is cool. Like, this is great. Like, I almost kind of like, why did we have to wait so long to get here?
Yeah, couldn't I have just had these two all along? There was a great moment, I think, when Lev constantly refers to the WLF as like your people. I can't believe what your people did. Because they both believe that the other side is horrible and evil, and their own people are lovely and wonderful, which is a misguided view that people, I'm sure, on opposite sides of wars often hold or are sort of indoctrinated to hold. And by this point, Abby's in effect, she's kind of been she's in the same position. She's now an outcast from the wolves because of the decision she's made. And I can't remember the specific incident, but Lev makes a comment like, oh, look what your people did. And Abby says to him, you're my people. And I thought that was quite a nice, like, powerful moment, that she's chosen to throw a lot in with this person who she's met and formed a bond with, rather than her own quote-unquote people, her own side.
Which kind of doubles down on that theme from the first game. It's like family is who you choose to love, not who you're born with necessarily.
Yes. Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, and I guess maybe to touch on the game's ending, we get, as you say, that almost like, well, 2 points. That finale that we alluded to sees you, very interestingly, fight against Ellie as a boss fight. You controlling Abby, which was really unexpected. And Abby basically wins, and it's Lev who stops Abby from slaughtering Ellie and Dina. So yet another positive point in Lev's favour is that he's the one who persuades her to show mercy, again, for the second time, to these people. And again, it feels like maybe, is that the end of the game? That Abby, as her character arc is, she's learned to show mercy, become a more merciful person thanks to Lev, and Ellie has learned the foolhardy error of, what were you hoping to achieve with this stupid revenge quest? Why don't you and Dina just go and live and be happy? But then we get that kind of false finish that we alluded to, where knackered old Tommy turns up with one eye and a limp because he got shot in the face or whatever during that finale, and he's kind of managed to track down Abby and Lev. He's heard a rumour that they're in Santa Barbara, but I can't go because I'm crippled now, so you're going to have to do it, Ellie. And Dina's like, piss off, get out of our house, don't bring your hatred here, we're just trying to live, we moved on from all that. But of course Ellie hasn't moved on, and she ends up leaving in the middle of the night and heading to Santa Barbara to revisit this never-ending kind of revenge obsession. And that was another unexpected kind of twist that I liked, that Ellie gets there, we're back in control of Ellie. Abby has been captured by some local horrible scumbag kind of slaver gang, and Lev. And when Ellie finally gets to Abby, she's kind of strung up on a not like a crucifix, but like a big pole stuck in the ground on the beach.
That crucifix image, though.
Absolutely, definitely. And Lev there as well. Lev's kind of unconscious, wasting away, barely looks alive. Abby is still clearly alive, but she's this withered husk of her former muscle-bound self. And you just have what, quite frankly, is the most kind of horrible, harrowing, unsatisfying. It's like a finale battle between almost like two people who don't even want to be fighting, really. Ellie just feels this weird sense of duty that she has to do it. Abby doesn't want to die, so she has to fight back. She's begging Ellie to just stop. And it's just awful, like real kind of eviscerating kind of scene. I'm not criticising it. I thought it was really good and powerful. And then, I suppose in a way, a happy ending in a sense, that Ellie her memories of Joel switch suddenly from the battered, bloodied corpse that she holds Abby responsible for to a happy memory of her last relatively pleasant conversation with him, and she decides to just let Abby and Lev go, and Abby and Lev survive. They bugger off in the boat and, you know, get to continue to forge a new life in the apocalypse. Ellie also survives, and we get that quite sad, well, very sad scene where she goes back to her and Dina's home to find that Dina and the baby have left, packed up all the stuff, and they've left. We don't know where they've gone. And Ellie, I think she picks up Joel's old guitar and tries to strum a tune on it, and because she's lost 2 of her fingers in that final fight, she can't even strum the guitar properly, and so then she moves on, you know, to her own, whatever her own future holds. And I don't know. I thought that was a really good, powerful ending. What did you think?
I'm kind of divided on it as well. Like, I think when you confront Abby, I think there's a nice kind of misdirect towards the end of the game when you're entering this essentially field of crosses in a way, and you are looking for Abby. I think they put a character kind of towards the front of the lineup that looks kind of like Abby from behind, and so you walk up to that cross and it doesn't have any kind of interact prompt, and you're just kind of like, well, what's going on? Why can't I, you know, pull her down and ask for a fight, you know? And then you realize, you look close, you're like, oh, that's not her. That's not who I came for. Because there are, you know, probably a dozen of these poles out there. Each of them kind of has a person strung up on them, and you end up kind of looking around and finding kind of in the back of the group, this Abby ultimately is like completely eviscerated in a way. Like, she's completely famished. Like, she used to be a huge hulking figure. She's now like extremely skinny. Like, she's been malnourished, almost to the point of death already. And you feel terrible. You pull her down, she walks off to a boat. You want Ellie to just let her go because she's been through so much. Yes. And by that point, just speaking from my own personal experience, I was way more on Abby's side than I was on Ellie's throughout like the vast majority of the story. So I was just kind of like, let her go, especially let Lev go, you know, let the 2 of them go off and live their lives with the Fireflies. You know, maybe kind of like have some sort of emotional time to kind of patch things up together. But ultimately, I didn't want to fight. And I think the fact that it does make you fight isn't necessarily like a bad thing in and of itself. I think it would have been, it would have been interesting if maybe you got to choose which character you were playing as in that final scene.
Yes, I thought that. I agree. I agree with that, which almost like pick your side.
But like, I don't hate the idea of being forced to fight as Ellie and doing something that you fundamentally disagree with, because that's the way that part 1 ended, and that is a powerful ending. I think in this case, it didn't work for me because I had been doing things that I disagreed with since like the first quarter of the game with Ellie, and so continuing to do things that I didn't agree with wasn't a reversal on my experience. It was just Ellie continuing to be shitty, which I just like, yeah.
You'd got tired of after doing it for 50 hours or whatever, or however long you'd played it by that point.
I was just like, stop doing this. Having to play 1 chapter of doing something that you disagree with is an interesting experience, but like, it's not a surprise. It's not a reversal. It's not a make you think moment anymore if you spend 3/4 of the game doing something you disagree with.
Yeah, and so that, but again, interesting to hear a different take on how you kind of experienced that ending. There was one thing I read on a, I don't know, YouTube comment, because I was listening to the soundtrack. Should touch on that actually. The soundtrack, the sort of haunting acoustic guitar soundtrack by Gustavo Santaolalla, which I'm sure I've completely mispronounced again, but is fantastic. It's very kind of moving, evocative, sort of haunting stuff. And I found some YouTube mix of like all the sad bits, which is most of the game, to be honest. But was listening to that, and I had a quick scan of the comments, and somebody's pointed out that I think Ellie says to Abby, "Just take him and go," meaning Lev. So obviously Abby gets Lev in the boat, they bugger off. But maybe Ellie didn't mean Lev. Maybe Ellie meant Joel in a sense, like, you know, you've taken him from me, sort of, you take his memory, and that, I thought that was an interesting interpretation of that line.
It really even seemed like that point at which she essentially let Abby go, I felt like it was because she had been damaged past the point of fighting. She had her fingers bitten off. Like, it felt like that was what was motivating her to kind of forgive and forget, not her coming to like an emotional or a moral epiphany. Like, it felt kind of ambiguous, and ultimately it doesn't really matter that much, but it would be kind of nice to have like a clear moment of like dawning realization of the worth of humanity in a way. Yeah,
it could have been more clear cut. It was a little bit not muddled, but like you say, unnecessarily ambiguous. Maybe didn't help get that point across, because you still, maybe Ellie's merciful decision in the end. It almost struck me as a bit like out of the blue, like, oh, she's not going to kill her. That's a bit weird, because she's been really obsessed with it.
She's gone through as well.
Yeah, almost. It was like, I'm not saying I wanted Abby to die at Ellie's hands, but if it had happened, it would have seemed more in keeping with I thought maybe the ending was going to be Ellie finally kills Abby and then feels like shit. But so maybe that little twist again. Did it work? Did it not work? It's certainly, if nothing else, it prompts a lot of opportunity for discussion and dissection. That is for certain. Well, we have thoroughly dissected this game, and there's so much more we could have talked about, and I would love to, but I should probably let you get on with the rest of your day. Well, I suppose in final summation then, Ryan, is there anything else you wanted to cover, or maybe if you wanted to just offer us a summary of the Last of Us franchise and your thoughts on it, and perhaps why you feel it ultimately is worthy of a place in the Hall of Pain?
So I'm kind of divided on the whole experience in a way. Like, I think that from a pure kind of mechanical level, working my way up to the more complex issues here, I think that the gameplay loop is a lot of fun, and I found myself like really enjoying this loop of cover-based shooting during shootouts with other human enemies in The Last of Us Part 2. I think particularly like really kind of clicking for me there was like a multi-tiered parking lot in Seattle that I remember having a lot of fun with, and having to kind of like circle my way up to the top of this parking lot and shooting shooting people from all different angles and trying to, distract them to change cover and pick up supplies and craft while I was on the move, and pick up ammo from fallen enemies, because you never have enough ammo. It's a survival horror in that way. And so like that was really fun. And I really want like a DLC for this game that is essentially just kind of like challenge rooms in a way. Like, I would love for this to be turned into kind of like a Dead Cells or Hades style roguelite, in a way where you can just kind of like go through challenge rooms of these like really well designed enemy encounters, because there's so much that so much in there that like is just like a real blast mechanically to play. But I don't really want to go back and play the game again, because there is so much downtime in between those action segments. I think even more than The Last of Us Part 1, Part 2 has a significant more amount of walking, puzzle solving, exposition in between the sections that are more kind of mechanically engaging, which nothing wrong with that. Like, it serves its place in a game that is narrative first. Like, totally do not begrudge them that. But it does kind of disincentivize like further replaying and engaging with the mechanical systems. Definitely. On an aesthetic level, of course, like the game is lovely to look at. I think there's a lot of really incredible environments. I spent a lot of time, especially in the early game, taking a lot of pictures in the photo mode, and just really kind of like loving and enjoying spending time in these game worlds. Ultimately, that's what inspired me to buy the game. I was going to wait on this one, but I decided to buy it like fairly early on, because I'm kind of a sucker for virtual Seattles, and you don't get a lot of, it's not like LA or New York, which is in like every video game. Like, I love seeing, especially like how accurate portions of the city are. And I was really curious going into it, like knowing Seattle as well as I do, because I've lived there for 7 or 8 years, like, how well am I going to be able to navigate? And it turns out not very well, because the city is so overgrown with plant life and is so like destroyed that like you can't really, there were intersections that like I recognize and I'm like, I know exactly where I am. And I know that if I'm heading towards the water, which is, where the Ferris wheel is, I should be going that direction, like that. I can get. And like, I understood like, okay, I'm in Pioneer Square. If I'm working towards downtown, I want to be generally heading in that direction. But like moment to moment, it wasn't as evocative of real world Seattle as I was hoping. But there were some incredible things. There were a few points at which I play PS4 primarily by using a long HDMI cable from my front room, which is where the PS4 is, to string it up to another computer monitor, so I can kind of do stuff on one of my other monitors and while playing PS4. So
all right, that's clever. That's
so I pulled up Google Street View on my center monitor, and I had The Last of Us Part 2 on the right monitor. And there were a couple of scenes in particular where the buildings and like you could just like look around, stand in a spot, especially in front of the temple at the very beginning of the Jewish synagogue, at the beginning of the Seattle section. Like you could position the camera.
Yes.
You essentially just kind of stand in that intersection and pull up Google Street View, and like every building will be accounted for. It is like eerie how good a job they did at reproducing that. But otherwise, like I didn't feel like it was like it didn't strongly benefit me to be a Seattle native to navigate this world.
And of course, they're unlikely to ever set, I don't think we're ever going to get Grand Theft Auto Wigan, but, I can still hope one day they'll set a game in the place where I'm from. Lots of pie shops to be infiltrated.
Well, hey, Flight Simulator.
Interesting.
But, I mean, a couple more points in the Seattle bit is like, one, I was kind of surprised at how much liberty they took with the inside of the Seattle Convention Center. I was really excited that you could go into the Seattle Convention Center, but, the inside was like, had the kind of, the feel of being inside the convention center, but like the layout was nothing like it. And I was kind of disappointed because I'm like, that's where PAX is held. And so if the video game community was going to recognize as a whole any one landmark within Seattle, like that would be it, the inside of the convention center. But like it turned out not to be the case, and it might be because of, architectural copyrights or whatever. So, I'm not going to begrudge them that, but it's like, that would have been a nice moment. And also I feel like it would have been nice to have one apartment that had the layout of Fraser Crane's apartment from the TV show, just as like a nice Easter egg.
A missed opportunity.
It didn't happen. I was really looking for it, and didn't happen. I was very disappointed by that. But I
think there was a Silent Hill reference in there. I think there was like an apartment 302 or 312, and it was quite Silent Hill-esque, I think. Or maybe I'm just constantly seeing Silent Hill references where they don't really exist. Yeah, because I love that game so much.
But I think overall, the experience of the first game was really kind of special and really unique. They did a good job of really kind of taking you from set piece to set piece and making the journey interesting along the way, giving you interesting kind of things to chew on throughout this journey. And I feel like they told a self-contained singular story. And on the announcement of part 2, I was kind of resentful that they are franchising that story and are making it kind of an ongoing, The Last of Us 2, this time with more, it didn't need a follow-up. And that was kind of a common talking point, and it was something that I think Naughty Dog was kind of anticipating. And so they, very early in their marketing, they said like, we wouldn't be setting another story in this universe unless we had a story to tell. Even after playing the game, I ended up liking it more than I was expecting to, but I still don't know if it like really gained anything by being a follow-up to the previous game. Like I kind of like the things that really connected with me were like Lev and that story, and the gameplay's great, and I love the, kind of exploration of Seattle. Like that's cool, but like the connection back to the first game, like didn't end up doing a lot for me. And so I kind of almost wish this was like just a different.
Yeah. Abby and Lev's story without necessarily the Joel and Ellie bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if it's set in the Last of Us universe, like you could still call it The Last of Us 2, just kind of like take out all the references to The Last of Us 1. Like I didn't need that connective tissue. I don't know if it necessarily made the game stronger. It just kind of ended up frustrating me with Ellie because I felt like I wasn't on the same page that the writers wanted me to be on. So it was, I don't know. I'm kind of undecided on part 2.
Yeah, that's very, and again, as we said before, I think I probably, for whatever combination of reasons I ended up on that page completely. So it's sort of what they were trying to pull off sort of worked on me, and maybe that explains why I'm generally more positive about the game than perhaps you are. But it's very interesting to hear that kind of like alternate take. It may be in a sort of dramatic role reversal. Rather than you sort of successfully pitching and convincing me to put The Last of Us in the Hall of Pain, you've probably persuaded, in some ways, presented a compelling case for why certainly the sequel, maybe is not an absolute masterpiece that the first one was. But I'm going to put it in the Hall of Pain anyway because I like it. So I still haven't quite figured out, in my head, the Hall of Pain is like this series of jail cells. Stephen King's in one of them. We've got Salad Fingers is in another. But then when it's like a franchise, I don't really know what is in the cell. Like, is it just a copy of the game on a bed in the corner? I'm not sure. Is it some sort of representative? I'm not sure which character that would be. I wouldn't want to put Lev in prison because he's ace. So maybe it's Joel. Maybe it's just Joel, dead Joel, just lobbed in the corner as a new entrant. But
wow. Grim, yeah.
It's a pretty grim place. Well, thank you, Ryan, for making an appearance today. It was lovely to talk to you, as always. And before you escape, and avoid ending up getting locked in the Hall of Pain yourself, is there anything else you would like to certainly plug away? Any of your upcoming podcasts or other work?
Yeah, gosh. We talked about Cane and Rinse, we talked about Sound of Play, mentioned Playwright at the beginning. I still would love to get more people to listen to Playwright. Like it's a really fun, creative exercise. It has its group of listeners, but it feels like we're not growing. We're just kind of keeping the same group, which is fine. But it's a really fun project, and I think people would end up appreciating it. So why not give it a listen?
Absolutely.
Playwright, Playwrite.
Certainly second that recommendation because I have listened to the show several times and really enjoyed it. And I need to give it I haven't listened for a little while because I do, as I said, this kind of Sound of Play is always my sort of go-to podcast. But Playwright is excellent, and people should certainly check that out. Well, I think that's it. We haven't yet, we're into our second series now. We still haven't come up with a decent outro for this show, so it's always like a really awkward kind of no you hang up kind of ending. But Ryan, maybe to put you on the spot, can you come up with a really cool, dark, sort of punchy outro slogan for us to end the show on?
Let's see. Have a horrifying October and a spooky Halloween. It's kind of a nice pleasantry, but
it's lovely, and I will not waffle anymore and detract from it. On that note, we will end it. And thanks again, and see you all soon. Thank you once again for listening, and a huge thank you again to Ryan for appearing on the show. Of course, one of the perils of recording something a couple of months before you actually broadcast it is that any outros that reference specific months become very quickly out of date. So as at the time of broadcast, we hope you had a good October and November. although actually, I guess if this is being listened to in the distant future, potentially by an alien civilization who are trying to understand the greatest artistic output of the Earth and the human race, then references to October or November or December or specific years or millennia will all have blurred into a mound of dust and relics, studded only with podcast episodes and DVD copies of Friday the 13th. Anyway, thank you again. And if you do want to help out the show, if you enjoyed it, then please, tell your friends or leave us a 5-star review, both of which will be hugely appreciated. We'll be back again soon for a Christmas special. We'll keep that under wraps exactly what we're going to be covering, but it is definitely a dark, festive favourite. And Liam will be back for that episode too. He's been in stasis for a bit as part of his beauty regime. Okay, I'll shut up now and speak to you all again soon.